Hello to all of you in person in Venice and to those joining us from far and wide. My name is Michael Griffin and I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas with you connecting with research on later Greek Neoplatonist ideas of virtue. I'd like to say a special thank you to the organizers of the conference and to the hosts, grazie, and also it's a particular delight to be able to share some of these ideas in connection with Venice, where so many of the manuscripts for the Greek Neoplatonists that I've been studying are housed. So as a very brief roadmap, you can see on screen the link to the current handout, is.gd/Olympiodorus arete, and hopefully you'll also have access to a copy of the handout directly. The brief roadmap here outlines what I hope we can do in the next 20 minutes or so. So there's a brief introduction to Olympiodorus and his theory of human goodness. I'll take a bit of time to walk through the scale of virtues itself, and then I'm going to discuss a problem or a question that arises about the scale, specifically how it's possible at the same time to engage in embodied civic activity while pursuing a more disembodied spiritual contemplation. And in a way this can be answered partly in terms of the sequence of two steps on the scale. So let's get started with section 1. Just very briefly to introduce Olympiodorus himself. He probably lived between about 500 and sometime after 565 CE in Alexandria, as we know from the datability of one of his lectures on the meteorology of Aristotle, which is datable to the spring of 565. He was a pupil of Ammonius, the son of Hermias, and succeeded to Ammonius's public chair in philosophy. And some of the anecdotes about Ammonius in the early lectures on the Gorgias are a nice illustration of how Olympiodorus's teaching routine develops from Ammonius's own. Olympiodorus's theory of human goodness or education could be summarized partly as the striving for likeness to God, homoiosis to Theo, in the language of Plato's Theaetetus 176b. For Olympiodorus, philosophical education is integral to that project of human goodness and likeness to God. Philosophy is unique in achieving the goal of making people good, as Olympiodorus mentions in the Alcibiades and Gorgias commentaries. Within the broader ambit of philosophy, Platonic philosophy is especially important because reading Plato conduces even to the highest levels of human goodness, to inspiration or enthusiasmos. At least we could infer that from some of the comments that Olympiodorus makes in the Alcibiades commentary and elsewhere. So just briefly, some of the texts on the handout, text 1 to 4, illustrate this theory on Olympiodorus's part. In text 1, that Aristotle's philosophy conduces to the good. In text 2, that Plato's philosophy does this, and in particular, Plato's enthusiasmoi or inspirations are significant. We'll pick up some of the significance of that word a little bit later. And then text 3 and text 4 together illustrate a little bit of the tension that we'll explore later in the talk. So first in text 3, which is from the Gorgias commentary, 42.5, there's a quotation of Socrates saying, "If they accuse me asking why I'm teaching the young people, will they ever be persuaded that I do this in their interest, so that they might become good human beings?" In a constitution that's difficult, Olympiodorus glosses this passage. One has to create a fortress or tachyon for oneself. And he takes that word from the famous Quietist passage in Plato's Republic about philosophers taking refuge behind a little wall and then live quietly behind or within that wall all the time. So in this passage, there's a sense of how one might seek to benefit the young, which we'll see is significant to Olympiodorus, as a kind of outward or practical expression of philosophy. But if it's challenging to do that, then to take refuge and find a place where one can philosophize safely. In a way, there might be resonances here of Olympiodorus's own experience in late antiquity, in a period and a place increasingly hostile to pagan intellectualism. Then in text 4, from earlier in the same lectures on the Gorgias, it's worth inquiring in what sense the philosopher frequents the agora, the marketplace. For the philosopher ought to lead a quiet life, that same idea of hesukia and bion, and the philosopher goes there in order to convert misguided youths and lead them on a nobler path. So on the one hand, one can lead a quiet life as recommended in the quietest passage in the Republic, and maybe get into philosophical contemplation safely in a challenging atmosphere. But on the other hand, the philosopher seems to have a civic calling to convert the young, to educate, and to make people good. So in a way, that tension between contemplation and practice, which is bequeathed to some degree by Aristotle, in the tension between embodied civic goodness in Nicomachean Ethics 1 and contemplative goodness in Nicomachean Ethics 10, is picked up here in Olympiodorus, and we'll see that the scale of virtues is integral to the solution that he might offer, the way he can see both aspects of life being functional for the philosopher. So let me just briefly try to introduce the scale of virtues itself. And I won't take too long on this, but I hope we can explore a little more in discussion as well, because this is just one interpretation of Olympiodorus' version of the scale. It could be divided into 3 parts, and here we're thinking of steps or bathmoi of human goodness. The first 2 are about a preparation for the rational activity of philosophy. The middle 3 are about the activity of philosophy itself, particularly the logos of the soul. And the last 2 are about what goes beyond philosophy, about inspiration, or in some ways theurgical practice. So there's 7 bathmoi, or steps in full, and we'll just go through them in that sequence. First, those that are preparatory to philosophy. The very first kind of excellence or goodness flows from nature, physis, in particular from our temperament, or krasis, and other conditions, for example, the planets and their locations when we entered our vehicle and embodiment on Earth. So for example, we might be courageous, as Olympiodorus says at one point in the Phaedo commentary, like a lion, because it's temperamentally just our nature in an embodied sense. Then there's excellence that flows from habit, or ethos. And this can be educated by wholesome stories and music, the kind of education that's usually called musicae, in addition to philosophical myths like the Pythagorean golden verses. And just as in Aristotle's Ethics, these natural and habituative kinds of excellence can lay the groundwork for philosophical wisdom, or practical insight in life. And this takes us to the second group of 3 virtues, or modes of excellence. The first of these is constitutional, at least that's an attempt to translate politicae, arete. This kind of excellence is consciously intended and developed. It's cultivated as the organization of the 3 parts of the soul in Republic 4, logos or reason, thumos, spirited emotion, and epithumia or appetite. This can also be educated by philosophical study, for example, Plato's Alcibiades, Gorgias, and Republic. In the 4th stage of catharsis, or catharticae arete, logos alone is the focus. And now logos is drawing its attention away from even the harmonized psyche of 3 parts and liberating itself in order to attend clearly to the forms or patterns of reality. This process of purification can also be cultivated by philosophical study, for example, reading Plato's Phaedo with a good teacher, and by spiritual exercises. The next stage is contemplative excellence, or theoreticae arete, and really this is the culmination of the process that purificatory excellence was. So achieving a clear vision through this process of the purification of attention in logos allows us to see the ideas or the forms of ourselves in reality, with us as the subject of that vision. This can also be cultivated by philosophical study. We mentioned before that it's very similar to the contemplation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 10, and for the Neoplatonists, this can be cultivated by reading some texts of Aristotle, like the Physics and Metaphysics, but also Plato. And with Westring's reconstruction, there might be a sequence of dialogues that cultivate contemplative excellence: Cratylus, Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman, Phaedrus, Symposium, and Philebus. So those readings are integral at this stage, as well as spiritual exercises that attend them. So those are the 3 philosophical stages of excellence. Following those are some that come beyond philosophy. And as we'll see a bit later, it's also possible to conceptualize these as occurring alongside, or even in their turn making possible, the previous philosophical forms of excellence. Here we have, as the 6th stage, as I'm reconstructing it, paradigmaticae arete, which arises from now not being the subject but the object of the contemplative vision that occurred in stage 5. At this stage, one can recognize one's own idea or form or pattern as the object of theoria. This can be educated by theurgical practices, by inspired art and literature, and by oracles like the Orphic and Chaldean texts. Following this, and perhaps distinct from it, is inspired excellence or enthusiastique arete. And here, and perhaps in the preceding stage, we're in the domain of what Damascus calls hieratic excellence. Olympiodorus often uses this language of enthusiasmos or inspiration, which we also find emphasized in Hermias's commentary on the Phaedrus, which draws on Syrianus's lectures on the same theme. Here, most strictly, we're talking about inspiration of the one of the soul, hentes psyches, directly from the god. So there's a sense of direct inspiration here. But there's also other kinds of inspiration that can occur in mind or soul or body. So these stages of excellence are, in a way, the crest of philosophical achievement, and in a way they can motivate and also be the ultimate result of the work of arete that we've been describing. There's a number of texts in the handout that illustrate how the scale works, its sources in Plotinus, Enneads 1-2, and in Porphyry's Launching Points to the Intelligible, sentences 32, and some of the more synoptic texts, particularly in Damascus and Olympiodorus's Phaedo commentaries. And you can see some of these more detailed texts in T6 and T7. But I'm not going to go through that full summary here. I'll just draw on one text of Olympiodorus. This is text 5 on the handout. It's from the Alcibiades commentary, page 172, 5-12, and it focuses on the scale in terms of self-knowledge. You can see it's a little bit different in the earlier stages, but brings out in a way how the philosophical and post-philosophical stages intersect. So self-knowledge is one of the terms that's homonymous, said in many ways. It's possible to know oneself in respect of one's external possessions or one's body, and that's the pre-philosophical kind of excellence. But then it's possible to know oneself politikos, constitutionally, when one knows oneself in the tripartition of logos, thumos, and epithumia. It's possible to know oneself kathartikos, that is in purification, in liberation from the pathe, or affections. It's possible to know oneself theoretikos, in contemplating oneself as liberated. It's possible to know oneself theologikos, when a person knows themselves according to their paradigmatic idea, now that is, as the object rather than only the subject of the contemplation. And it's possible to know oneself enthusiastikos, or inspired, when one knows oneself katatohen. Here, picking up some language from Hermias, we can tell that we're focusing on the one of the soul, and thus bonded to the proper god, oikeos theos, one acts with inspiration. So here there's a sense that there's not only a sequence in time of these steps of virtue, but there's also a kind of simultaneous superposition where one can know oneself as any of these levels of being, potentially at the same time, but distinctly. And I'll try to say a bit more about why I'd like to emphasize that atemporality of this self-understanding in a few minutes. So again, I'm not going to talk through the longer texts, T6 and T7, but for discussion we might spend a bit more time with those texts and the others in Olympiodorus. I'm also not going to talk through the constitutional or politicae arete support texts, which help to illuminate some of the ways that I think Olympiodorus and the later Neoplatonists understand this harmonization of logos, thumos, and epithumia in the person. I'm going to briefly focus on some of the ideas about inspiration in section 2.4, and then spend most of the rest of our time talking about the simultaneity of contemplation and embodied activity. So just briefly, for Olympiodorus, this kind of enthusiasmos or enthusiastique arete of inspiration leads, as text 12 suggests, to a kind of authentic life, being fused with one's own proper theos or god. As the following text suggests in Plotinus, there's a sense that with this kind of self-understanding there's an ambiguity about whether one is seeing oneself or another, in Ennead 6.9, 9-10. And with Hermias in the Phaedrus seminar, pages 91 and 94, there's a nice example of how this looks in practice. So inspiration in the true sense, here we're talking about the crest of the ladder of virtues, occurs in connection with the one of the soul, hentes psyches, and there are 4 kinds of mania that constitute this true inspiration according to Hermias. One associated with the muses, which harmonizes the parts of the soul, one associated with Dionysus, which makes them whole, one associated with Apollo, which makes them one, and then the highest kind of mania is erotike mania, eros, which receives that unified soul and joins it to the gods and to intelligible beauty. So in that state of inspiration at its best, again, we're at the peak of the scale of virtues. Okay, so now for the theme of the simultaneity of contemplation and embodied civic activity. Just to set up this question, part of the challenge is that Porphyry illuminates a kind of alternative in his treatise on abstinence, book 1, chapters 41 to 42. This is at least one way to put the problem, even though, again, the tension goes all the way back probably to Aristotle and to Plato. According to Porphyry, it's not possible, while being carried hither and thither, to be there in the intelligible world despite being here in the sensible world, because we pay attention not with part of ourselves, but with all of ourselves. Ugar mere hemon al holoi tas prosokas poiumetha. So we can't at the same time be fully engaged with the intelligible and the sensible. But many barbaroi, he suggests, foreigners or other thinkers have been overthrown by thinking that someone impassioned by sensation can be active about the noeta, or the intelligibles. So that suggests a kind of tension between engaging with the intelligible and engaging with the sensible. On the other hand, Porphyry in his Life of Plotinus, 8:7-24, seems to describe Plotinus as managing to do both at once. So just briefly, Plotinus was able to keep his train of thought engaging in conversation to the full, while never relaxing his self-turned attention, proseoton prosake, and his continuous turning or epistrophe in contemplation to nous. So on the one hand, in the Life, we have a sense that Porphyry is interested in how Plotinus was able to simultaneously attend to sensory and intelligible matters. On the other hand, in the treatise on abstinence, we have this sort of idea that one can only do one thing at a time because one can only attend to one thing at a time. Olympiodorus seems to pick up a little bit of this alternative as well in terms of the scale of virtues. So in the next text from the Gorgias commentary, 26, the philosopher who's acting theoretikos with theoretike or contemplative virtue always flies to the divine, but the politikos, the person acting with politike arete, remains and shapes their citizens, picking up some of the language we saw earlier with Olympiodorus from the Gorgias commentary. So that seems to suggest that there's these two alternatives, these two different things that one can do. But coming now to section 3.2, I'd like to suggest that this isn't a matter of something one does at one time and another, but a way of attending, or at least I'd like to explore that interpretation. So in the next text, Olympiodorus on the Phaedo 1.4, he draws on this lovely passage of Empedocles, the fragment that the intelligible and the sensible come into existence alternately, but not, at least on Olympiodorus's interpretation, because the sensible world begins pata at one point and the intelligible world at another. No, rather it's because our psyche sometimes lives in accordance with the intelligible, and at that time the intelligible world arises, and sometimes in accord with sensible things, when the sensible world is said to arise. And he draws on the reigns in Orpheus of Uranos, Kronos, Zeus, and Dionysus to illustrate this. That's because the soul has tokens of all the virtues in the scale of virtues, as the passage goes on to explain. This idea that it's not temporal, pata, that there's the sensible and the intelligible, is pretty intuitive in terms of Neoplatonic metaphysics, but also in terms of experience, as the next passage from the Alcibiades commentary of Olympiodorus, page 5, would suggest, lines 13-22. It's possible for beings here in the perceptible or sensible world to exist above in the intelligible world in a contemplative matter through sympatheia, even sort of stripping off the pneumatic vehicle of the soul, like Odysseus strips off his rags at the beginning of Odyssey, book 22. or at least that seems like one way of reading the passage. So how would that work, this kind of sympatheia of being here in the sensible and also existing in the intelligible? So some of these passages from Hermias, which I'll close with, might offer an illustration. In the next text, which is Hermias page 58 to 59, it's suggested that inspirations come to us from the gods at different times according to the nature of our life, and being receptive to them is helpful. The illustration here is Socrates in the Phaedrus, who acts with purification and elevation to help Phaedrus in divine passion. That is, he's inspired by the nymphs because he's caring for Phaedrus and he wants to help him. And this is the right thing for Socrates to do. The next text, which is Hermias again, pages 89 to 90, illustrates that even though in the strictest sense, inspiration, here talking about the highest level of the scale of virtues, comes to the one of the soul, that is the highest part of us as a person, it's also possible for every level of the soul to be inspired, perhaps daimonically, that is nous or intellect, dianoia or discursive thought, the non-rational soul, and the body itself can also be inspired, as those pages of Hermias's commentary work out. And this very case of Socrates wanting to help Phaedrus comes up a little earlier in the same commentary, Hermias again, page 77, lines 20 to 25. In the case of the gods, they can engage in their primary activity, say contemplation, and not depart from it even as they radiate their secondary and tertiary activities, just as the sun continues to be the sun internally while expressing light externally. But a human being is contingent in the sense, or can act contingently in the sense that they're able to neglect their primary activity and so err while they're projecting, probably, their secondary activity. But that might not be the case. So as the next text, which is Hermias on Phaedrus 78 suggests, in the case of Socrates, the ascent to contemplation, or this is theoretike arete, coming from politike arete, is easy and smooth. And why is that? Because he didn't give up his primary activity while he projected his secondary activity. And even if he had given it up, he wouldn't have been far from it, because he conducted himself well even in the area of his secondary activity. He only needed to turn back. So if we think back to some of the passages of Olympiodorus suggesting that it's a matter of self-knowledge in a way, which level on the scale we're activating or engaging, and also the idea that we can be receptive to different inspirations, that as Hermias suggested, drawing here on Syrianus' system, belong to different facets of ourself, the one, nous, dianoia, and the tripartite soul and the body itself. It's not a matter of sort of temporal alternation, but simultaneously holding to one's internal or primary activity of contemplation while also projecting a secondary politike activity, which Olympiodorus describes as teaching, helping the young, and in this case is Socrates' elevation of Phaedrus. So hopefully that suggests that drawing on the scale of virtues, and especially the capacity for inspiration at every level, it is possible at one and the same time to engage both in contemplation and civic activity. So I hope that's some contribution to this much larger discussion of both the embodied and unembodied activity of the person and the philosopher in Neoplatonism, and political philosophy in late antiquity, which has been studied so well recently, and I very much look forward to our conversation.